welcome, Dr. Tremper Longman. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So I am Tremper Longman. Right now, I'm the Distinguished Scholar and Professor Emeritus of Biblical Studies at Westmont College. I was, before that, the Robert Gundry Professor there. Um, I retired from full-time teaching in 2017, but I still lecture and write books and translate, which is I'm one of the translators of the New Living Translation, one of the senior translators, but I also was involved in a number of other translation projects as well.
Awesome. So, what's a verse that gives you or gave you the most trouble when translating?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. There are lots of difficult verses in the wisdom literature in particular. Job is one of the hardest, if not the hardest, book to translate because it has some rare words. It's poetical, and poetry by sort of definition is harder to translate than prose because it's much more terse or brief, and you don't get a lot of grammatical signals like you do in prose. So I'm not sure I can boil it down to a single verse. I happen to be also going over the page proofs of the second edition of my Ecclesiastes commentary, and chapter 12, verse 10 was difficult in a substantial way as to whether to translate it. You know, Kohelet sought to find the right words. And what he found was true, or whether he sought to find true words. And so in the first translation, he found true words to write. And in the second translation, it's he tried to find them, but maybe he didn't, kind of thing. So, I mean, another difficult verse is in Job 19. Um, I know that my Redeemer liveth, is the way Handel puts it, but it's filled with all kinds of difficult philological and textual issues. So great question, but I could probably cite a whole bunch of examples for you.
Is there like something in the Hebrew that can't be like translated in English? Is there any like construction or word that makes it difficult like that?
Well, first of all, one thing to know about translation, when you're translating from any language to another language, they don't line up neatly. Oh, here's a good example, I think, also from the wisdom literature. Proverbs 1:7 and a bunch of places talk about the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so a lot of people uh, question the translation fear there, and maybe say it should be respect or awe or something different, reverence for the Lord. And so that's a place where you have to there's not a neat English word that captures all the nuance of the Hebrew word. So there's a good example. And I argue that the best translation is fear. Um, but we have to qualify that when we're talking about it to say that it's not the kind of fear that makes you run away. Obviously, it's the kind of fear that makes you listen and obey.
That's pretty interesting. We really don't have a word that's like almost a respectable fear, like
Yeah,
a
right,
loving fear in a weird way.
right, right. And some people think that awe, or reverence works, but I don't think it works, because when we think of awe, we think of wonder. And of course, we should have awe toward God. The question isn't whether we should feel awe, but the question is that what this particular word in this particular context is communicating. As I say, the fear of the Lord is always connected with obedience. So it's a emotion that leads us to obey.
Is there any quote or verse in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that people today commonly either misquote or misunderstand?
There are a lot of I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. Well, I it depends. All A lot of passages are open to misunderstanding or misinterpretation. And
Mhm.
well, let me maybe, Rocco, I should start with this statement, which is what is important for us to understand for our salvation is absolutely clear. It's not ambiguous that God created everything, including us. It's not ambiguous that we have a sin problem because of our own choice, not because God made us that way. It's not ambiguous or unclear that God has worked through history to reconcile himself with us, and that culminates in Jesus Christ. All those things that are essential for our salvation are clear. I think it's really important to keep that in mind as we then say there are an awful lot of things that are open for discussion. And I don't know why, but a lot of them even stem from, you get the translation right. Like we all agree that Genesis 2:7, which says that God takes some dust and blows on it, and the first human being is created, or we could even debate whether that's what it's intending to say. But then you uh, can have a discussion whether that is meant literally, that God literally took dust to the ground and breathed on it, or whether it's a figurative depiction of God creating human beings that communicates that we're part of creation, and but that we have a special relationship with God. So, yeah, they're, um, and so one of the things I'm doing right now actually is writing 4 books for Lexham Press on navigating tough texts of the Old Testament. And I finished the first volume, which is on the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, where I have taken 60 or 70 particularly difficult passages and written short essays, which I hope are clear as to how we might understand them, and navigating some of the difficulties of the text. And now I'm writing on the historical books, a second volume. So I think Christians often struggle with the Old Testament because it's more distant from us culturally, chronologically, and even redemptive historically, since it comes from the time before Christ.
That's pretty interesting. So, like, on the topic of like misunderstandings and like, I guess different pathways you could take verses. If you could sit down with one biblical author and ask them any question, who would it be and what would be your question?
Um, wow. That's a great question too. Awful lot of the Old Testament is anonymous, so we don't know who the author is. Uh, but of course, I'd love to sit down with Moses, talk to him. I'd, you know, love to meet David, though I think he's a much more complex figure than Moses. Um, and I New Testament, of course, Paul would be interesting, though he strikes me as kind of annoying sometimes. But that's all right. God used him.
Hmm.
God even uses high strung, annoying people for his purposes.
So, is there anything in the Bible that people today don't want to hear? Like, is there any ideas in the Bible that today like we can't stand, in your opinion? for a lot
Oh,
of people, I should say.
yeah. And I'll keep referencing my books since I wrote a book called Confronting Old Testament Controversies for Pressing Questions. So, well, probably one of the things an awful lot of Christians today struggle with is this idea of God as a warrior coming and using Joshua and the Israelites to, you know, to fight against the Canaanites. Awful lot of people struggle with that these days. And yeah, so, and well, to be honest, too, another one of the four controversial issues is sexuality. And again, a lot of people struggle with the Bible's sexual ethic in the light of contemporary thought. And yeah, um, so those are a couple big examples.
Hmm. So, could you walk me through how the translation process works?
Sure, sure. So and different translations have different processes, but most of them work through communities of scholars, except for, well, even the Message to a limited extent, even though, Eugene Peterson was the main translator of the Message, but he used consultants, including me, to respond to his translation. But so the way it works, let me use. So I was in charge of Psalms and Wisdom books in the Old Testament for the New Living Translation. So I would produce an initial translation of the Psalms, and then I would send it to three colleagues who are experts on the Psalms, and then they would respond to me and they'd say, Tremper, we don't think you got it quite right here, or Trevor, you were totally wrong here, or whatever, or would you consider this translation? And so those three scholars would send that back to me, and then I would evaluate what they said, and then I'd send it back to them, and then give them another chance to look at it. And then once I came to the place where I thought it was ready to send it to the stylists, who were experts on English language, and they would work with it because Hebrew scholars are not necessarily uh, ready to produce the best English, but they'd work with our understanding of the text and then make suggestions of stylistic changes that didn't affect the meaning. So I'd work with the stylist, and I'd send them back to the three scholars, get there. So it's a long process. And then
Yeah.
finally, when that process is worked through, then the translation would go to what we called the Bible Translation Committee, which the six senior translators were on. There was an expert in the Pentateuch, an expert on the prophets, expert on historical books, Gospels and Acts, and Pauline and the letters. So the six of us plus three or four stylists, plus a couple other people would get together and hash out the final version of the text, and then uh, now, and that we did that work back in the 1990s for the New Living Translation, and into the early 21st century. It came out in its present form in 2004. And now it's 20 years later, and we're doing a major review of it after 20 years. So we're not going through as extensive a process, but like I'm working on the Psalms now, and since and by the way, I was the youngest of the six original translators, and I'm 72 now, and I was the youngest by 10 years. So And then, two of my dear colleagues have died, and we replaced them with younger scholars, and those of us who are my generation have taken on younger understudies with whom we're working, and they'll eventually take our place. But a translation, particularly a translation like the NLT, but every translation should do a major review every 20-25 years, because the English language changes enough in the quarter century. And then sometimes we have new insights into the Hebrew text. So this is a very healthy process that every translation should undergo.
So, you when it like just when it starts. So like when you first write down the translation and you
Yeah.
send it over to um
The other three
the
translators.
other three translators. How do you get over like a disagreement where one side's like, okay,
Yeah.
this is what it means, and the other side's like, absolutely not. Like, does that ever
Yeah.
happen? And what? How do you
Oh,
come to a conclusion?
yeah. Well, first of all, um, we choose people to work with who A are experts in their field and B are not narcissistic, uh, you know, highly opinionated. Um, in other words, we don't pick people who can't work well with others. And so, and then sometimes it comes down to a vote of, you know, 3-1 or whatever. Well, 2-1. I mean, no, it'd be sometimes it could be 2-2, and then I get to break the tie because I'm the senior translator.
Hmm.
Um, and there was a discussion, just to give you one example. Um, one of our translators of Ecclesiastes felt strongly that the word hevel should be translated transient or temporary rather than meaningless. That word meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. And, when he had written a book about this, I knew his position. I wanted him on the translation committee because he has had a lot to offer it. But the other two translators and me disagreed with that translation, and we made our arguments. And the scholar who wanted it to be transient was, he would have preferred that we went his way, but he accepted, our conclusion. So there, I don't remember any acrimonious fights. Though I have to say, one of the reasons why the NLT made sure to choose scholars who were team players, so to speak, to work on the project is because uh, the original NIV committees had a lot of acrimonious fights from, according to people who worked on it, who were in the generation before me. That the NIV came out in 1984, so I was a very, very young scholar when that I was still finishing my doctorate. But one of my mentor, Raymond Dillard, was on the NIV committee, and he told me, yeah, they got kind of angry and would sometimes yell at each other and so forth. So it can happen.
Well, yeah, I was talking to recently. I got the chance to talk. I don't know if you know Mark Strauss. Do you know Mark Strauss? Oh, he's.
Mark's one of my best friends.
Oh, really?
We've done 2 or 3 projects together. Yeah, Mark is great
He
on
said,
this topic.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I asked him about it. He said it was, I think, his favorite time of, like, I forgot how many times they meet, but it was really interesting. It's cool to see how it changed over time,
Yeah.
because it seems to be
Yeah.
so in like a much better area now than it sounds like it was
Oh yeah,
before.
but I know everybody on the NIV committee, and they're all wonderful people. The present committee, uh, Mark and Karen Jobs and Bruce Walke and Doug Moo, and the list goes on. There, Sandy Richter. Yeah, so and that's also an interesting. Speaking of Sandy, who's a Old Testament professor. Matter of fact, when I retired from being the Robert Gundry chair, she became the Robert Gundry chair at Westmont, and she's on the NIV committee. And it's just, and Karen too. And my understudy is Brittany Melton. I mean, when the NIV did their original work, and when we did our original work in the '90s, there weren't a lot of women or ethnic minority evangelical scholars and uh, around. And now there are many wonderful women scholars and ethnic minority scholars who are actively engaged in these big evangelical translation projects. And it's brought up wonderful, you know, perspective. We all bring different perspectives to the text based on who we are, and so it's good to have a within the evangelical. That's kind of a sine qua non for the NIV and the NLT, and that is, it's an evangelical Bible translation. Your theology affects your translation. Of course, your theology comes out of the Bible. So there's this kind of hermeneutical spiral, as Grant Osborne once called it. But yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay. So, how would you convince someone to read the Old Testament in 30 seconds or less?
Well, maybe if I say it's all about Jesus. Okay, it's all about Jesus. Um, that Jesus said the whole Old Testament, Luke 24, is all about him. So if you want to know Jesus, read the Old Testament. You can also know a lot about the Christian life. You have to understand that there's continuity and discontinuity between the Old Testament, but it's still very relevant to your life. It can transform your life and bring you closer to Jesus.
Oh wow, that was pretty perfect. That all 30 seconds. All right. Well, um thank you. I appreciate you coming on here.
Oh,
Um
yeah, thanks, Rocco. Thanks
yeah.
for having me.
Yeah.